August 19th, 1942, deep in the thick jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Genjiro IMI of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company opened his diary and wrote down what so many Japanese soldiers were feeling: shock. Through a ceiling of palm trees and choking vines, IMI and 916 other men from Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki's unit had just stepped onto the island. They'd arrived by destroyers during the night, confident this landing would be the first move to take back Henderson Field. They had been told the Americans were weak, maybe 2,000 men at most. Poorly trained, soft from lives of comfort. Colonel Ichiki even brushed off warnings to wait for more troops. "These are Americans," he told his officers. "We'll throw them into the sea before sunrise." But none of these battle-hardened veterans, men who had only known victory since 1937, were ready for what was coming. It wouldn't just be a defeat. It would be a total collapse of everything they believed about war. Their tactics, their strategy, even their confidence in their own invincibility. The jungle itself would turn against them. The darkness they thought they owned would betray them. American firepower, coordination, and sheer destructive force would crush the myth of Japanese superiority in close combat. The tide had started to turn 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 U.S. Marines from the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. Under General Alexander Vandegrift, the Leathernecks launched Operation Watchtower, the first U.S. offensive in the Pacific. Their mission looked simple on paper: capture the nearly finished Japanese airfield, build a defensive line, and hold until reinforcements arrived. But in reality, they were stepping into the toughest, longest, and most brutal campaign the Marine Corps had ever faced, in a place that would push human endurance to its limits. Guadalcanal was no paradise. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its center a wall of jungle-covered mountains rising into constant clouds. The coast where Henderson Field sat was swampy, choked with tall grass and tangled trees where you could barely see a few feet ahead. The heat was suffocating. The humidity never dipped below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick that men breathed them in. Rivers that looked clear on maps were full of parasites. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would end up taking out more men than enemy bullets. But that first morning, when the Marines reached the airfield, they found it almost undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops on the island didn't stay to fight. They ran into the jungle, leaving behind their equipment, supplies, and most importantly, the airfield itself. By the evening of August 8th, American engineers were already hard at work finishing the runway. They named it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot who had been killed at Midway. Within just a few days, the first American planes would land there. The island was about to become the base of the famous Cactus Air Force. The Japanese struck back fast and hard. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer in a daring night attack. In less than an hour, the Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in U.S. Navy history. For heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra were sunk. More than 1,000 sailors died in the burning waters. The surviving Allied ships pulled back, taking with them most of the supplies that hadn't been unloaded. The Marines were suddenly alone, cut off, short on food, equipment, and support, facing a determined enemy that was getting stronger by the day. But the Japanese High Command didn't yet understand just how critical Henderson Field was. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the surrounding seas during the day. American planes could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single fact would shape the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese could move at night, using fast destroyers in what became known as the Tokyo Express. But when the sun rose, American aircraft owned the sky. Japan now had only one real option: retake Henderson Field before the Americans could dig in and make it unbeatable. Imperial General Headquarters gave the job of retaking Guadalcanal to Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. But Hyakutake didn't have a lot of troops ready. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kayotake Kawaguchi was stationed at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was still in the Philippines. The closest unit he could use was Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been near Guam. This regiment had originally been assigned to the Midway invasion, a mission that never happened after Japan's defeat in June. Colonel Ichiki had a reputation as an excellent tactician. He had taught at infantry school and was admired for his battlefield skill. But he was also impulsive and completely confident that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome any American advantage in weapons or equipment. Before leaving Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki was clearly ordered to wait for the rest of his regiment before launching any attack on Henderson Field. But he didn't take those orders seriously. In his mind, the Americans were weak. He had studied reports from China and the Philippines, and everywhere Japanese troops had fought Western forces. The pattern seemed obvious to him. They panicked under pressure, lacked discipline, and couldn't match Japanese soldiers in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers quietly brought 917 men from Ichiki's first element ashore at Taivu Point, about 15 miles east of the marine perimeter. The landing went smoothly and unnoticed by the Americans. Ichiki immediately sent out patrols to scout the enemy's strength and defenses. It was a standard tactical move, but this time it would lead to disaster. The next day, August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal trail toward Coley Point when they suddenly ran into Japanese troops. A short, brutal firefight broke out. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured important documents. These papers confirmed that a large enemy force was nearby, and, even more crucial, showed that the Japanese badly underestimated how many Marines were on the island. Captain Brush rushed back to the American lines with the intel. General Vandegrift instantly recognized what it meant. A Japanese attack was coming soon, most likely from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce the defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the mistake would stick in every history book afterward. Cates quickly deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. John Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines took up positions along the riverbank, carefully placing machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire across the sandbar. What followed would go down as one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki made a fatal decision. Instead of waiting for reports from his missing patrol or for reinforcements to arrive, he ordered an immediate attack. On the night of August 20th, leading into the early hours of August 21st, he sent his men straight into a frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine at the time put great faith in the power of spirit, courage, and aggressive night attacks to overpower enemy firepower. Ichiki was convinced his experienced soldiers could smash through the Marine lines with boldness and close-quarters fighting, where Japanese troops excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped after hours of brutal torture at the hands of the Japanese, stumbled into the marine perimeter with a warning: the enemy was coming. Minutes later, the jungle exploded with gunfire. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged out of the darkness, yelling war cries, firing their rifles, and throwing grenades. But the Marines had prepared for this moment. The M1917 A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns roared to life. These heavy guns, perfected during World War I, were reliable and deadly, each one capable of firing 600 rounds a minute non-stop as long as its water jacket stayed cool. The Marines had positioned them perfectly so that no part of the sandbar was left uncovered. The first waves of Japanese soldiers were cut down almost instantly as .30 caliber rounds tore through them. Those who managed to cross the sandbar met 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, massive shotgun-like shells that ripped through flesh at close range. Wave after wave of Japanese troops kept coming, charging head-on into the storm of bullets. Some made it to the Marine lines, and desperate hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the dark. Marines used rifles, bayonets, knives, even their fists. But the defensive line held. The overlapping machine gun fire created a wall of death that the Japanese couldn't break. As dawn broke over the river, the attack was over. Colonel Ichiki's assault had been shattered. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water, a devastating loss that would echo through the entire campaign. Daybreak brought no mercy for the surviving Japanese. General Vandegrift quickly ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across the sandbar, moving steadily into the coconut groves where Japanese soldiers had taken cover. War correspondent Richard Tregiscus watched the tanks from a Marine position and later described the scene. It was fascinating to see them bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We hadn't realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, around 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, mostly support troops who had stayed near the landing site, slipped away into the jungle. They managed to send a radio message back to 17th Army headquarters reporting the scale of the disaster. Colonel Ichiki was among the dead. Accounts of his death differ. The official Japanese story claimed he burned his regimental colors and took his own life in ritual suicide. Some Marines, however, believed he died leading a final desperate charge. Marine casualties were about 40 killed and wounded. The psychological blow to the Japanese was enormous. Captured documents and later accounts revealed their shock. An entire regiment had been wiped out in a single night. The Americans had not behaved the way Japanese doctrine expected. They hadn't panicked under a night assault. They hadn't broken in the face of screaming warriors. They had stayed calm, held their positions, and turned the night into a killing ground. The Marines' defense at the Tenaru didn't just stop the Japanese, it exposed their weaknesses. The Americans had deliberately allowed the Japanese to push into carefully planned killing zones, then methodically wiped them out with concentrated firepower. The real shock for the Japanese came when they examined the battlefield and captured equipment afterward. They realized they had completely underestimated American material strength. The Browning machine guns had never jammed, never overheated, and never failed from lack of spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support the Marines could call in was far greater than anything the Japanese could match. And the coordination between infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire from offshore ships formed a seamless, deadly system the Japanese army had never faced before. But despite the disaster at the Tenaru, Japan wasn't giving up. Within days, more troops were already heading toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched a massive naval operation to support the next push to retake Henderson Field. On August 16th, 3 slow transport ships left Truk, carrying the rest of Ichiki's regiment, about 1,400 soldiers, along with 500 naval marines. But after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons left one of the transports badly damaged, Japanese command abandoned the use of slow ships altogether. Instead, they turned to destroyers for rapid night supply runs, what became known as the Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers ferried nearly 5,000 troops from Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express was brilliant at moving men. Fast destroyers could race from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, making them hard targets for American aircraft. But there was a fatal flaw in this plan. Heavy equipment couldn't come with them. Artillery, tanks, trucks, and even enough food and ammunition had to be left behind. That meant every Japanese soldier arrived with only what he could carry on his back. They had to live off the land or sneak in whatever supplies they could through American lines. This crippling lack of logistics would haunt every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal, and ultimately doom their attempts to take the island. As the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on, Japanese troops faced a new enemy beyond American firepower: starvation. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and their men were arriving with little more than what they could carry. General Kyoto Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan was ambitious, a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coast. Another would attack from the south through thick jungle, aiming for what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main force along an inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. But what Kawaguchi didn't know was that the Americans were already a step ahead. Marine intelligence had identified this ridge as the most likely route for a Japanese attack. On September 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, led a raid on Tasimboko village. There, he discovered massive Japanese supply dumps, confirming that a large enemy force was gathering nearby. Edson immediately grasped the plan. The Japanese would come from the south, straight down the ridge. He asked General Vandegrift for permission to fortify it. Vandegrift agreed. On September 10th and 11th, Edson moved about 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion onto the ridge. He positioned his men with the same precision and care that had made the Tenerife defenses so deadly. Machine guns were placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Mortar crews locked in on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions in advance. Every inch of terrain was measured and used to maximum advantage. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, made up of 3 low hills covered in Kenai grass and scattered trees. On either side were deep ravines, choked with dense jungle and nearly impassable. It was perfect ground for a Japanese night infiltration, and if properly defended, it could also be turned into a killing field. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces attacked. Unlike Colonel Ichiki's reckless frontal charge weeks earlier, this was a more sophisticated assault. Japanese infantry slipped through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, trying to surround the Marines. Small units probed the lines, looking for weak spots. When they found them, larger forces gathered to punch through. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and often face-to-face. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves grappling in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had crawled to within grenade range. But the defenses held. Each time Japanese troops massed for a breakthrough, Marine mortars and artillery answered with devastating precision. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 shells that night, dropping high explosives dangerously close to their own lines to break up the attacks. Shrapnel tore through the air, wounding their own men in exposed positions. Machine gun crews fired non-stop until their barrels burned red in the dark. The Marines fought with whatever they could grab: rifles, pistols, knives, even entrenching tools. Sergeant Major Jacob Veer, the same scout who had warned about the Tenerife attack, moved up and down the line, encouraging the Marines and pointing out where the Japanese were slipping through. Sergeant John Basilone held a key machine gun position that became the heart of the defense. When the rest of his crew was killed or wounded, Basilone kept firing alone, stopping wave after wave of Japanese attacks. His bravery that night would earn him the Medal of Honor. 2 Marines would receive the Medal of Honor for their actions at Edson's Ridge, and 19 others would be awarded the Navy Cross. When dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese had failed to break through. But Kawaguchi wasn't done. He still had more troops and was ready to attack again that night. Edson pulled his lines tighter around the center of the ridge, strengthening the defense. General Vandergrift sent in more troops, raising the total to about 2,500 men. The Marines now had stronger positions and heavier firepower. When the Japanese returned for their second assault, the battle was even fiercer than before. Kawaguchi threw everything he had into a desperate push to break through before the Americans became unbeatable. Japanese soldiers charged again and again, running straight into the deadly storm of machine gun fire. Hundreds were cut down. Some attackers got as close as 50 yards from Edson's command post before being stopped. At one desperate moment, Edson himself picked up a rifle and joined his men on the line. But once again, the Marines' firepower and prepared defenses held strong. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely fallen apart. The cost was massive. Around 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers were killed on and around Edson's Ridge. The Marines lost about 104 men, with more than 200 wounded from the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge would forever be known as Bloody Ridge, a brutal symbol of how effective American defensive tactics could be. For the Japanese who survived, the battle was a shock. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies all revealed the same realization. They had expected to fight infantry hand-to-hand in the darkness, where they believed their training and spirit would win. Instead, they ran into precise artillery, machine guns, and mortar fire. The Americans knew exactly where they were coming from. They built killing zones. They waited, and then they unleashed overwhelming firepower to wipe out entire waves of attackers. The fights at Tenerife and Bloody Ridge set the tone for the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces relied on courage, night attacks, and close combat. The Americans countered with superior firepower, coordinated attacks, and carefully prepared defenses. The result was always the same: devastating Japanese losses and heavy, but manageable American casualties. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Jungle warfare on Guadalcanal was hell. The island itself became a deadly enemy. Malaria struck almost everyone who stayed there for more than a few weeks. By December 1942, Over 8,000 Marines had malaria. 2/3 of the division was disabled by tropical diseases. Dysentery was everywhere. Fungal infections rotted skin. Jungle rot caused wounds that wouldn't heal in the heat. Untreated dental problems turned into serious infections. The Japanese suffered even more. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The Tokyo Express couldn't deliver enough food. Soldiers often survived on scraps they foraged in the jungle, with tiny amounts of rice that had to last far too long. Starvation became part of daily life. Medical supplies for the Japanese were almost non-existent. Their stock of quinine, used to prevent malaria, ran out quickly and was never properly restocked. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that could have been easily treated with basic medicine. Captured Japanese reports later showed just how bad things were. By late October, more than 60% of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal was crippled by disease and malnutrition. Combat strength had dropped to barely 30% of what it should have been. Around 50 soldiers were dying every single day, most not from enemy fire, but from starvation and illness. The situation for the Americans was very different. Thanks to air cover from Henderson Field, supply ships regularly brought in food, ammunition, medicine, and replacement gear. There were tough times early on, especially in August and early September after naval defeats, but the shortages didn't last. By October, the supply flow was steady. Marines ate canned rations that might not have tasted great, but kept them strong. They had enough ammunition that machine gunners could shoot until their barrels wore out, then simply get replacements. Field hospitals had surgical teams, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs to fight infection, and the ability to evacuate the badly wounded to safer rear hospitals. The Japanese, on the other hand, were left with whatever they could sneak in on destroyer decks or carry through enemy lines. Soldiers often stretched one rice ball to last an entire day. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that they were ordered not to fire unless absolutely necessary. Medical care was minimal, a bandage if they were lucky, an amputation without anesthesia if they weren't. And for those too badly wounded to move, the brutal reality was even worse. They were given grenades and told to end their own lives rather than slow their units down or be captured. In late October, the Japanese launched their biggest offensive of the entire campaign. General Hyakutake personally came to Guadalcanal to lead the operation. This time, he brought in troops from the 2nd Division, including battle-hardened veterans from China. The plan was ambitious: attack from several directions at once, with the main force striking from the south through the dense jungle, just like at Bloody Ridge. But now they had more men, better coordination, and even artillery that had finally made it ashore by destroyer. The offensive kicked off on October 23rd with an attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because they were so hard to transport, led the charge across the Matanikau River. But the Americans were ready. Soldiers from the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment, backed by anti-tank guns, artillery, and an M3 Stuart tank, knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in rapid succession. The attack collapsed, leaving heavy Japanese losses. The main assault came the night of October 24th to 25th. Around 5,600 Japanese soldiers under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, aiming to break through the lines protecting Henderson Field. Defending them were the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines led by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, along with elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. What followed became one of the most legendary battles in Marine Corps history. Japanese troops came in wave after wave through the jungle. Every time they broke through, Marines counterattacked immediately. Machine gunners fired until their weapons jammed or broke, then picked up rifles and kept fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines rained down dangerously close to their own lines, hitting the enemy just yards away. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready to provide naval gunfire if needed. At one critical point, just a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field. But they held firm. And once again, Sergeant John Basilone, already a hero from Bloody Ridge, played a key role in keeping the line from breaking. When ammunition started to run low for his machine gun section, Sergeant John Basilone didn't hesitate. He personally carried heavy ammo belts through enemy fire to keep the guns firing. Under fire, he repaired damaged machine guns on the spot. When one of the gun positions was overrun, he grabbed his .45 pistol, led a counterattack, and took it back. By dawn on October 25th, The massive Japanese assault had failed. Major General Yumio Nasu was dead, cut down by machine gun fire during the night. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers were killed trying to break through. The Marines suffered several hundred killed and wounded, a serious loss, but one they could recover from. October and November 1942 also saw brutal naval battles that changed the course of the campaign. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12th to 15th, became one of the fiercest surface battles in history. On the night of November 13th, in chaotic darkness, American cruisers and destroyers clashed with a Japanese bombardment group that included the battleships Hai and Kurashima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, two senior American officers, were killed in the fighting, the only U.S. flag officers to die in surface combat during the war. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with several more damaged. But the Japanese lost the battleship Hai, crippled at night and sunk by aircraft the next day. Most importantly, their mission to bombard Henderson Field failed. The airfield stayed in action. On the night of November 14th to 15th, Kurashima tried again. This time, it ran into the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Using radar-directed gunnery, the Washington fired 9 16-inch shells into Kurashima from ranges so far the Japanese could barely see their target. Kurashima sank with heavy loss of life. Even worse for Japan, their last major convoy carrying the 38th Division and heavy equipment was destroyed. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 made it to Guadalcanal, and all were wiped out by air and artillery before unloading. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers died in that disaster alone. This was Japan's final serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a properly equipped force. For the troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had counted on fresh reinforcements and supplies. Instead, they were left to starve and fight a losing battle. Instead, the Japanese soldiers learned the grim truth. The naval battles had been lost, their convoys were destroyed, and no more reinforcements or supplies were coming. Food rations were cut again. Men who were already starving were now told to survive on even less. Medical supplies, which had been scarce for months, were now gone completely. Makeshift field hospitals overflowed with sick and wounded soldiers, but the doctors had nothing left to give, only to watch their men die slowly. Captured Japanese diaries from this time reveal a heartbreaking story of collapse. Soldiers wrote about rice rations shrinking to just 1 small ball a day. Disease was everywhere. When they had the strength, they burned the bodies of the dead. When they didn't, the corpses simply lay where they fell. They wrote of eating grass and tree bark, of men dying after consuming poisonous plants. They described how once proud soldiers had turned into hollow, starving shadows of themselves. By December, the situation was hopeless. Japanese command at Rabaul decided to evacuate Guadalcanal. They couldn't admit defeat to the world, but inside, they knew the truth. Staying meant total destruction of the 17th Army. Only about 11,000 Japanese soldiers were left from the original 36,000. Of those, maybe 7,000 could still walk. The rest were too sick, wounded, or weak from hunger to move. The evacuation, codenamed Operation Coup, turned out to be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Over 3 nights in early February 1943, destroyers slipped in and rescued 10,652 men. But even that could not hide the scale of the defeat. At its peak, the Japanese had 36,000 troops on Guadalcanal. Between 25,000 and 30,000 of them died, around 14,800 killed in combat, and another 10,000 to 15,000 lost to disease and starvation. American losses were painful but replaceable. About 1,600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and thousands more temporarily disabled by disease. But unlike Japan, the United States had the resources to recover. New divisions were already training. Ships and planes were being built faster than they could be lost. The momentum of the war had shifted for good. And perhaps most devastating of all was the psychological blow to the Japanese military. Guadalcanal shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility. For the first time, their forces had been defeated in prolonged ground combat. Every major offensive had failed. Their tactics, once feared, had proven no match for American firepower, leadership, and endurance. The defeat at Guadalcanal changed everything. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later shared their experiences, either in memoirs or interviews, repeatedly came back to a few hard truths. First, they admitted they had completely underestimated American fighting ability. Second, they were stunned by how much better equipped and supplied the Americans were compared to what Japanese intelligence had predicted. Third, they recognized that their own logistics simply weren't built to sustain a long battle against an enemy that controlled both the sea and the air. And fourth, they learned that spiritual strength and tactical skill meant little when faced with overwhelming firepower and resources. Many veterans openly acknowledged how wrong their assumptions had been. They had believed they were the superior warriors, better trained, more disciplined, more willing to die, and masters of night fighting and close combat. But Guadalcanal taught them a harsh lesson. Modern war is won by systems, not just courage. The Americans had systems for everything: supply chains, medical care, artillery coordination, air support, and reinforcements. And those systems worked. Japanese systems didn't, because they had never been built to handle a campaign like this. Japanese veterans also pushed back against their own government's wartime excuses. They admitted that American troops fought incredibly well at night when defending prepared positions. They noted that even though the Americans suffered from malaria, dysentery, and brutal jungle conditions too, they kept fighting effectively because their logistics supported them. They described the sheer power and precision of American firepower. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The difference in weapons alone made a huge impact. Japanese soldiers carried Arisaka bolt-action rifles, which had to be manually cycled after every shot. At first, American Marines also used bolt-action M1903 Springfields, but they soon began carrying M1 Garand rifles, semi-automatic with an 8-round clip. The Garand gave them a faster rate of fire and a clear edge in close combat. The gap widened with machine guns. The American Browning M1917A1 was water-cooled and could fire almost non-stop as long as it had water and ammunition. Japanese machine guns like the Type 96 and Type 99 were lighter, but couldn't sustain fire for long periods. In a defensive fight, that difference was devastating. But perhaps the biggest advantage came from artillery. The 11th Marines used M1A1 pack howitzers, 75mm guns that could be broken down and hauled through the jungle. They could deliver fast, accurate fire whenever it was needed. Japanese artillery couldn't match that speed, flexibility, or volume. All of these factors combined into one overwhelming reality. The Americans weren't just tough soldiers, they were backed by a war machine built to win. American fire support on Guadalcanal was fast, accurate, and devastating. Forward observers stationed with infantry units could call for artillery fire and get rounds raining down on enemy positions within minutes. In contrast, Japanese artillery was weak, hard to move through the jungle, limited in number, and constantly short on ammunition. Naval gunfire gave the Americans another powerful advantage. Cruisers and destroyers offshore could hammer Japanese positions or deliver pinpoint fire to support Marines on the ground. With radio communication linking observers on land to ships at sea, their targeting was precise and deadly. Air power grew even more decisive as the campaign went on. The Cactus Air Force, operating out of Henderson Field despite brutal conditions, slowly gained control of the skies. American pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bombers and fighters. SBD Dauntless dive bombers hit Japanese troop concentrations, supply ships, and defensive positions. Japanese air units, flying all the way from Rabaul, were pushed to their limits. They arrived with little fuel and time to fight before having to turn back. American aircraft dominated the air above Guadalcanal. By January 1943, the tide had fully turned. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, made up of both Marine and Army divisions, launched a coordinated final offensive to wipe out the last Japanese positions. Artillery, air power, and naval gunfire worked together seamlessly. The Japanese, starving, sick, and nearly out of ammunition, fought bravely but couldn't stop the advance. On February 9, 1943, American patrols found the Japanese positions empty. The enemy had slipped away. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of brutal fighting had ended in America's first major ground victory over Japan. But the real impact went far beyond one island. Guadalcanal revealed the hard truths of modern war. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Courage and tactical skill alone could not overcome overwhelming firepower and superior logistics. Night attacks and close combat, tactics that had brought success in China, were crushed by strong American defensive positions. The campaign proved that supply and logistics weren't secondary. They were the foundation of sustained combat. Air and naval dominance determined what happened on land. Some Japanese officers saw the truth clearly. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, later wrote that Japan needed to rethink its entire strategy. America was fighting an industrial war, where victory depended on production and supply. Japan simply couldn't match that kind of power. But changing deeply ingrained military culture was another matter. For a military built on tradition and past victories, accepting such a fundamental shift was nearly impossible. Guadalcanal exposed the gap between old beliefs and new realities, and Japan would pay the price for not closing it. The official explanation for the disaster at Guadalcanal campaign blamed poor supply lines, naval defeats, and the unexpectedly strong American defenses. But behind those excuses was a harsher truth. Japanese tactical doctrine itself was outdated. The strategies that had crushed Chinese forces were useless against a modern industrial power like the United States. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal became living witnesses to a transformation they never imagined. They had marched into the campaign as proud warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they realized Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies reveal their shock. The Americans, they admitted, were not weak. They were overwhelmingly strong. Not just in firepower, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the relentless ability to sustain combat. Japanese forces had courage and skill. The Americans had systems, and that made all the difference. For the Americans, Guadalcanal taught a different lesson. It proved they could face Japan head-on and win. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in the jungles and ridgelines of the island. U.S. defensive doctrine worked. Artillery, air power, and naval coordination worked. And American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, could meet the Japanese on their own brutal terms. Yet victory also brought respect. Marines and soldiers who fought there never forgot the sheer determination of their enemy. Soldiers who charged into hopeless battles, who starved rather than surrender, who died rather than retreat. This unyielding resolve left a deep impression on the Americans. The contrast between the two sides was stark. American forces dropped leaflets, broadcast surrender offers, and promised food and medical care to prisoners. Few accepted. Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, most too weak or wounded to fight. The strategic consequences of Guadalcanal stretched far beyond the island itself. It was more than just the first major American ground victory in the Pacific. It was the turning point where Japan's myths began to crumble, and the reality of industrial war became impossible to ignore. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field, and the desperate evacuation that followed, proved a devastating truth. The Japanese defensive perimeter could be broken. The myth of an impenetrable Pacific empire was shattered. For the Allies, Guadalcanal marked the turning of the tide. The campaign showed that America's vast industrial and material power could be transformed into battlefield victories if applied methodically. The U.S. had the resources, the production, and now, the confidence, to go on the offensive. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end. The losses of experienced soldiers, skilled pilots, and precious warships could not be replaced. Factories in Japan simply could not keep pace with America's relentless production lines. The decision to evacuate, though never admitted publicly, was a quiet acknowledgement. Japan could not win a war of attrition against an industrial giant. The men who fought on Guadalcanal carried its lessons for life. American Marines and soldiers who survived became the backbone of new units, teaching others the brutal realities of jungle warfare, defensive combat, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off the island in December 1942, needed months of recovery before it was ready to fight again. For Japanese survivors, the future was far darker. Those evacuated in Operation Coup were scattered across the Pacific, bearing the psychological weight of defeat, and the realization that America was far stronger than their leaders had ever admitted. Many of them would never return home, dying in the island battles that followed as Japan's position collapsed piece by piece. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars for decades. Wrecked aircraft, rusting tanks, shattered ships, and unexploded ordnance lay hidden in the jungles and coral shores, silent witnesses to 6 months of unrelenting combat. Henderson Field, expanded and improved after the campaign, became a key Allied base for the next phase of operations in the Solomon Islands. For military historians, Guadalcanal became a textbook in modern warfare. Amphibious operations, jungle logistics, air-ground coordination, and naval integration. It proved that victory required far more than bravery and tactical skill. It demanded industrial power, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain war across oceans and months of hardship. The human cost was staggering. Over 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen lost their lives in the battles around the island, on land, at sea, and in the air, each a reminder that Guadalcanal was not just a military turning point, but a human one. American losses at Guadalcanal exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses surpassed 30,000 men, the vast majority not just from combat, but from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Thousands more on both sides carried invisible wounds that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But in cold strategic terms, the cost was decisive. Guadalcanal was the pivot point, the moment the Allies shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It proved that Japan could be beaten on the ground, that air and naval superiority could be seized and held, and that American military systems could outlast even the fiercest resistance. The campaign was more than a battle for a jungle island. It was a clash between two visions of modern war. On one side, faith in the warrior spirit, courage and tactical skill believed to be strong enough to overcome any material disadvantage. On the other, the systematic, calculated application of industrial power, logistics as a weapon, firepower as a force multiplier, and combined arms coordination as the key to victory. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these two philosophies collided. 6 months of brutal combat revealed an inescapable truth. Courage alone could not defeat a modern war machine built on logistics, firepower, and coordination. Japanese forces fought with ferocity, but American forces fought with systems that never stopped working. For the Japanese survivors, Guadalcanal shattered everything they had been taught. Their training had been based on illusions. Their tactics were designed for another war. Their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their empire was fighting a conflict it could not win through spirit alone. For the Americans, Guadalcanal delivered different lessons. They proved to themselves that they could match the Japanese soldier in the brutality of close combat. They learned that industrial power could be transformed into battlefield dominance. They developed new tactics and doctrine that would shape the rest of the Pacific campaign. Japanese troops came to fear not individual American soldiers, though they were formidable, but the relentless weight of an enemy that never ran out of ammunition, never ran out of food, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft ruled the skies, and whose factories replaced every loss. This was a terror not of death. Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept that, but of futility. The realization that courage and sacrifice meant nothing against a machine that never broke. From Guadalcanal onward, the Pacific War fundamentally changed. Japan was no longer on the offensive. It was fighting a slow, grinding, defensive war against an enemy whose material advantage grew with every passing month. The template forged in the jungles of Guadalcanal, logistics, coordination, and overwhelming firepower, became the model for every campaign that followed. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield. It was a reckoning,